Well, last week we were on page 6 of these notes, and I had just very rapidly run over the various approaches to the book of Revelation, and afterwards I was asked a little bit more about it, and I thought, well, I really should spend more time on this, I guess. Since it is of some interest to us, it shows us a couple of things about the book that are relevant. Let's begin with prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for the Scriptures. Thank you that you teach us from them and that you give us wisdom from them. We ask that you guide us today. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. There are basically 4 approaches to the book of Revelation. The futurist approach sees the book primarily as a series of predictions about what happens just before Jesus comes back. And that's the most common view right now. It certainly has not been the most common view in the history of the church, but in the 20th century it has emerged until recently as the most common approach to the book. The problem with it is, there are 2 problems with it. The first is that the book repeatedly says that the events are going to take place very soon. It's at hand. It's going to come quickly. Don't seal this up because all these things are at hand. And we looked in Matthew 24 and other places in the New Testament where the event that's at hand, that's very soon, that's coming in this generation, is the removal of the old creation. And so it's not the destruction of the world, but the transformation of the old creation that seems to be in the book. That's one problem with the futurist approach. They have to really minimize the actual statements in Revelation about when these things take place. Usually what happens is they say, well, the letters to the 7 churches took place soon, but the rest of it, look at all this fantastic stuff. It must be talking about the end of the world. And that's just kind of taken for granted. How could anyone disagree with that? Which, of course, we all fall back on common sense that we've grown up with, but sometimes our common sense has to be challenged. And there is this kind of common sense consensus out there that this fantastic stuff about the beast in Babylon, that must be just before Jesus comes back. It's too big to have happened in the middle of history. We'd have to answer that question. So that is part of the psychology that undergirds the futurist approach. The problem with it is that the only time language we have in the book indicates it happens soon. The second problem with the futurist approach is that I think probably without exception, futurist commentators think that they're living in the last days. And I don't think you run into a futurist commentator who says, this all deals with things that will happen just before Jesus comes back, but I have no idea what it is because it may be 10,000 years from now. That's not how this scheme works. It's always, well, we can see that the 10 horns of the beast are the common market. Or, we can see that the beast is Napoleon. Or, we can see this, that, and the other. In other words, the futurists always assume that they're living at the end. Now, after 2,000 years of people assuming each generation that they're living at the end, we ought to be suspicious of that mentality. An awful lot of people have been wrong about thinking they were living at the end. Which brings up another point along these lines. People say, well, we're supposed to be looking for Jesus to come back at any time. And that's supposed to be important for us. And in fact, it helps your sanctification to believe that Jesus is coming soon and to be looking for him. Now, if you think about that, there's a problem with that. If Martin Luther believed that Jesus was coming soon, he was wrong. Because Jesus didn't come. The world didn't end 500 years ago. So if it's supposed to have a sanctifying effect on your life to believe something that's wrong, that's a problem. If Irenaeus believed that Jesus was coming soon, he was wrong. If Thomas Aquinas believed that Jesus was coming soon, he was wrong. If Charlemagne believed Jesus was coming soon, he was wrong. If John Murray believed Jesus was going to come in his lifetime, he was wrong. And so if it has a sanctifying effect to be expecting Jesus to come right now and to believe he's coming soon, how does that square with the fact that we're sanctified by truth and not by being deceived? Basically, anybody who thought 1,000 years ago that Jesus was coming soon was wrong. They were deceived, and the idea that that had a sanctifying effect on their life just can't be true. I'm not saying it had a desanctifying effect, just that this isn't important. Now, Jesus is always coming soon. This book shows that he comes every Lord's Day. He comes to us at various times. He comes into history and culture at various times to bring judgments. This book shows it. So if we can just widen our vision of what it means to look for Jesus to be coming soon, we scratch that itch. We don't have to say, I believe the world is coming to an end and the entire earth is going to be burned up and the last judgment is tomorrow. I don't have to believe that. That's not important. I do have to acknowledge that Jesus is coming soon, like in about an hour and a half, as far as we're concerned, and at other times. And if we look at the comings of Christ that way, we don't have to be focused in on the end of the world. But to draw that discussion to a conclusion, the second problem with the futurist approach is they always assume that they're living in the last generation. And after about 30 or 40 years, their book is out of date. And Hal Lindsey said 1948 was the beginning of the end, and the generation lasts 40 years, and 7 years before the end you had to have the rapture, which means the rapture had to happen in 1991, and it didn't. So now it's all wrong again. But there were guys before him who said Mussolini, who headed up the revived Roman Empire, was the beast. Well, they were wrong, And every group of people that says we're living in the last generation and tries to take Revelation that way, each one is wrong. It's been wrong right along. So we got two problems. One is the language of the book itself points to a near event. Second of all, futurists just don't seem to be able to restrain themselves from not only saying these prophecies are for the future, but they're for right now. We're living in that future. If a futurist came along and said, well, I think these things will happen just before Jesus comes back, but I really haven't any idea what they refer to, he's almost given away the game, and then why not take one of the other approaches?
Yes, so Christ coming back, subject to always, and the people I associate with dispensationalists, always looked at it like the bridegroom could come back. You don't know what hour of the night he's coming back, so you're prepared for his coming back. And it's not that Christ was coming back soon, but could. And I think there's a difference between expecting him in reality and just anticipating that it could be at any time in history, which possibly it could be.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any scripture that says limits him to when he can come back. And so I think there is a difference there, and you can still polish the brass on the sinking ship as a dispensationalist if you don't think he's coming back tomorrow, but anticipate that it's possible. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you get down ready, you have your oil, and that's the way people I associated with look at it. I'm sure others do it other ways. But
well, I think you're right, and I'm glad you raised that point because it adds another dimension to what I just said, and that is that there are people who believe that Jesus could come at any moment and end history. Okay. And so it's good to bear that in mind, but they don't add to that a whole bunch of proofs that he must be coming in our generation. I still think that that's unnecessary, and the idea that you could drop dead at any second has exactly the same, you could have a heart attack and go out just like that, and that is just as much relevant as saying the world has to end. Jesus could come back and end the world at any moment. And I'm not completely sure that that's true, because it seems to me the Bible does indicate that all the nations will flow to Jerusalem to hear the word, and that hadn't happened yet, so for that reason I don't anticipate that happening. There again, that's another distinction of approach. Now let me say something positive about the futurist approach. At least the futurist approach tells us that the book is relevant. Okay, and it's because Revelation is written in symbols that it is relevant to every generation. And so when somebody comes along and says, well, look at this, Mussolini has got this revived Roman Empire, and he's taken over the government, and there's a whole bunch of corrupt church people involved with him, and they're oppressing the righteous, and this sure does look like the beast and the harlot getting together to oppress the saints. That's right. It is the beast and the harlot getting together to oppress the saints. I don't think that the book of Revelation is talking specifically about Mussolini and a corrupt church, or about Hitler and the German church, which was the name of the church that Hitler set up. But that's an application of the book. And somebody says, well, the fact that we got Hitler and Mussolini here, and they're a beast, and now we have these corrupt churches that they control who are oppressing and killing the evangelical Christians and the devout Catholic Christians and Jews and gypsies and other people, Jesus must be coming soon. That's true. Jesus did come soon. He came in 1945 in the form of General Patton and a bunch of other guys that brought this to an end, you see. So it's true in a general way that there's always beasts out there, there's always harlots out there, and they only last for so much time before Jesus comes and puts a stop to it. But Does that mean history ends totally? No, not necessarily. And so the applicability of the book to right now is something that the futurist has as a strength. And we don't want to lose that strength if we say that the specific events particularly prophesied in this book have had their first and definitive fulfillment early on. The principles still apply. So that's a futurist approach. And obviously, the amillennialists in the Reformed and Lutheran churches and the dispensationalists and modified dispensationalists in the fundamental churches are futurists. We'll talk about the history of these approaches a little bit later on. The second approach, which you don't have very many advocates of anymore, is the historical approach. The historical approach says, well, these things are going to happen soon in the sense that they start soon. But then, what Revelation does is it gives us a roadmap to the future history of the entire church down to the second coming of Christ. Now, the cross-reference to this is Daniel chapter 11, where if you read Daniel 11, you'll find that it clocks king by king in symbolic language, the kings of the north and the kings of the south. That is, the Greek rulers of Syria, the Seleucids, and the Greek rulers of Egypt, who were the Ptolemies. And then there'll be one king of the north, Seleucus Antiochus the first, will come and attack the king of the south, Ptolemy Euergetes, or somebody like that. And he'll give his daughter to the king of the north, but she will turn against him, and his daughter's name, you know. We can map out the history, and we can find that Daniel 11 tracks history kind of year by year, reign by reign. And so people said, well, Revelation does the same thing. Revelation gives us kind of a complete history of the church. And so it starts out with these 7 churches in Asia Minor. And then there's persecution from the Roman Empire here in chapter 6. These horses that come out and souls under the altar who were killed by Domitian and the other persecutions. And then there's judgment on the Roman Empire, maybe here in chapter 6. And God seals His saints in chapter 7 and delivers them. And then we have trumpets, and that is a judgment that comes on all the world in different places because of the invasion of all the wild tribes, the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths that swept over Europe in succession. And then the Vikings here are the locusts from the bottomless pit, or maybe even worse, those really are the Turks, the Islamic forces. And then God raises up an army from the Euphrates, which is the church, which holds off in Spain, the Cid, and in the east, the Knights of Malta, let's say, hold off these Turks. And then we have another cycle, and then we see the beast, and that is Roman Catholicism. And 666 comes out to the papacy in Serbo-Croatian or something. And then we see the saints up here, and saints are martyred. And then judgment comes upon the Roman Catholic Church, Babylon, and it's split up. And the Protestant Reformation follows. And that's the riders on the white horse. And then we see the millennium, which is a picture of the gospel as it goes forth into all the world through the missionary movement of the 19th century. And then it comes to an end. And then there's an attack of Gog and Magog, which is what's going on right now, because the missionary movement is over, and the communists and the common market have raised their ugly heads, and they are attacking the saints. And now the great white throne judgment comes, and Jesus is coming pretty soon here. And then we see a new heavens and a new earth, which is going to be on the other side of that. See? Now, Revelation gives us a complete history. That's one way to do it. And that was the approach everybody took at the time of the Reformation and among the Puritans, with one exception. One significant exception at the time of the Reformation. The problem with it is that the version I just gave you, you'll notice, kind of wound up with the millennium being the missionary movement, and now Satan is loosed, and that's right now, and Jesus is coming soon. So I've taken the book of Revelation, chapters 4 through 20, and I've stretched it out over the whole history of the church, but the only reason I can do that is because I believe I'm living at the end. Now, what if Jesus isn't coming for 20,000 years? Then we'd still be over here in about Revelation 5 or 6, maybe 7 somewhere. And that means that, actually the Turks are the second seal, and the Roman Catholic Church is the third seal, and the Reformation would be the first something. Let's see, what would the Reformation be? The souls under the altar, killed at St. Bartholomew's Day. And then the sixth seal with the great earthquake and all that, that would be the 20th century. And then, you see, if history is going to last 20,000 years, then we have to take Revelation and chop it up in littler bits. So the historical approach has always been, again, made by people who believed that they were kind of at the end so they could look back through and see what fit where. Rome, and the Vikings, and then the Turks, and then the papacy, and then the Reformation. And actually, the historical approach you can call papal-centric. The papacy winds up emerging as the big enemy in the book. The papacy is the Antichrist. The papacy is the man of sin. That's not in Revelation, of course. Those are from other places. The papacy is the little horn of Daniel. The papacy is the beast. And the papacy, since the Pope wears a triple crown, he is Christ's vicegerent on the earth, and so he wears a crown that means he has power over heavenly forces to bind and loose. And then he has a crown which means that he's head of the church, and there's a crown that means he's head of the papal states. So he has a triple crown. So the beast, the false prophet, and the land beast are the three crowns of the papacy. And then the papacy is Babylon. Well, what happens if you put all your chips on the papal interpretation? Well, what happens is in 1789, the French Revolution, which all of a sudden looks real bad. And the French Revolution comes in and they slaughter all the Christians. They eliminate the 7-day week and replace it with a 10-day week. They close all the churches and they set up temples to the goddess of reason, and they require people every 10th day to report to the temples of the goddess of reason to hear lectures on atheism, and so forth and so on. And it sure does look like the French Revolution is real bad. But we've already kind of used up the book of Revelation here. There's nothing left after Babylon to point to the French Revolution. And so what happened was the French Revolution kind of killed the papal-centric interpretation. It's kind of harder to maintain because, gee, that looks like a beast too. And then after that we have the rise of communism, which sure does look like a beast. And if you've already used up everything in Revelation to apply it to Rome, Roman Catholicism doesn't look as bad now as other things do. I mean, Mao Zedong is worse than Pope John Paul II. Or he was worse. Facts are coming out about him now that make him look like a real slime ball. I guess he demanded a different 13-year-old girl every night. Stuff like that. He was just, I mean, people always assume, well, he was at least an ascetic devotee of his ideology. Well, it turns out he was nothing but an Oriental potentate who slaughtered a few million people in order to get himself on a throne. Well, that's worse than the papacy in some ways. So you see what happens to the historical approach is it kind of plays out, and you find very few people who still hold this. The Seventh-day Adventists are still forced into it because of Ellen G. White's prophecies. She ties them into a historicist interpretation of the book of Revelation. So they continue to defend that Babylon is the papacy and certain other events of the Protestant Reformation and all the rest. But they're about the only ones who are still doing that.
I think an interesting footnote to the 10-day week that the French had was that it didn't work.
Yeah, it didn't work.
People kind of got tired. So it kind of points to every seventh day is a good day to rest. Yeah, there were several reasons. That's one of them. It just doesn't seem to work. Of course, in Paris they could enforce it, but they couldn't enforce it out in the rest of France, and the people just ignored it. And even in Paris, Christians snuck around and had church every seventh day, and they eventually it collapsed. But that's a bad thing, you see. So the historical approach kind of gave out. But at the time of the Reformation, that's what Luther held, and that's what just about everybody held, except Calvin. Calvin did not buy it. Calvin, in his commentary on Daniel, says the little horn is not the papacy, it's the Roman Empire. He says the bad king, the evil king in Daniel chapter 11 is not the papacy and is not a future Antichrist, it's Rome. And the comments that he makes on the man of sin in Thessalonians, he says the man of sin is not the papacy, it's not a future Antichrist, it's the Roman Empire. Now, Calvin didn't actually teach through Revelation, he kind of just left it. But it's obvious from his remarks that he took a preterist approach. That is, he took a view that the book was mainly dealing with things that would happen shortly. Calvin usually just tears up anybody who he disagrees with, but because all of his friends held to the papal-centric interpretation, he's fairly polite. But he does make it real plain in his Daniel commentary and other places where it comes up that he doesn't hold to it.
He believed in a near fulfillment, which is the approach that I will take as well and has itself a long history. So the futurist approach and the historical approach. The historical approach got really smacked bad by the French Revolution. And what happened was, in the early 1800s, you began to have in England primarily a series of Bible prophecy conferences. And the Bible prophecy conferences were kind of open to anybody. They were premillennialists and they were postmillennialists. And postmillennialism was the majority read in the Reformed churches present at these things. Darby and his people were present at them. Others were present at them. And they were trying to come up with a way of interpreting Revelation that made more sense. And out of this came two approaches. One was the futurist approach that we've already looked at, that Darby and the dispensationalists took real hold of. The other is the preterist approach, which said, no, this is mainly dealing with first century events, first and second century events. It's dealing mainly with the Roman Empire. And that was kind of the preterist approach at that time. It's not the approach that we're going to take, but it's one of the older preterist approaches. We'll get to that. And then also, falling out of the collapse of the papal-centric approach, you had people taking a thematic approach to the book. I'll call it thematic, and that's the third thing. That is, well, these don't really prophesy any particular events. They just show us what's going on all the time. Okay? This is dealing with spiritual warfare. There's always beasts. There's always Babylons. Babylon is the Jews, and it's the Judaizers. And you've always got apostates. You've always got Jezebels and Nicolaitans and Balaamites in the church, generation after generation. And there's always a beast out there somewhere, some civil servant, some IRS agent, somebody out there to try to stomp you in the face and tell you that unless you wear their mark, you can't buy or sell. And so these things do kind of come and go, but you know, when the beast really attacks and the dragon really attacks, we can have confidence that God will provide a great eagle and He'll fly us off in the wilderness. He's done that. The Huguenots got to flee from France and got to go to England and America, and so forth and so on. And so these principles are here. Well, of course, it's kind of hard to argue with that. That's true. And so the thematic approach has considerable value in that because the book is written in symbols, it's written in such a way to apply at all times. If all this was a prediction about the Roman Empire, it would say that. It would say, now there have been 7 emperors in Rome so far. And the one that's there right now, Nero, he's about to die. And there'll be some anarchy. And then a 7th will come, and he'll be named Vespasian. And it would just lay it all out, you know, in plain Greek. The reason it doesn't do that in Revelation is because by using symbols, we can speak about the specific events that are coming, but we can also provide categories that are good for all time, because there are other beasts. There are other Babylons beyond the beast and the Babylon in this book. So the thematic approach is quite helpful to anybody studying the book of Revelation. The only question is it really true to the text to say that's all that's going on? And the problem with the thematic approach is Revelation says these are events that are about to take place, not just ideas that are good for all time. And so we have to say it is a prediction of events that we can nail down to some extent, although it's also giving us themes and principles that are good for all time. So if we kind of drew a chart here, we would find in the early church not much dealing with the book of Revelation. In the medieval church, we can draw some dotted lines for the early church, and then dashed lines for the medieval church. Medieval church expositors usually saw the beast and Babylon as the papacy. Now that may seem strange to you because we're used to thinking that, well, the medieval church, that was the papal church. It was. But they knew that there had been bad popes. And so they said, well, when the church does bad and has bad popes, then the church is acting like Babylon. And so the papacy, on the one hand, is the vicar of Christ, but if you got a bad pope, it suddenly becomes the negative of that. It becomes the vicar of Satan. And instead of proclaiming the mystery of the kingdom, the papacy becomes the heart of the mystery of iniquity. And all the reformers did was take up that tradition and make it even more explicit. Instead of having a true and a false church under one umbrella, which was the medieval vision, you had a true church, which is Protestant, and a false church, which is Catholic. Okay? But basically, you've got this church historical Turks and all this stuff going along here until you come to the French Revolution. And then we get a split into three streams: the futurists, thematics, and the preterists. The preterists are the ones that say it happens soon. Now, in the 19th century, we can set aside the thematic approach because it only has a few adherents. Most people, they deal with the themes, but they also take one or the other approaches. In the 19th century, you have a development of the preterist view and of the futurist view. And among the Reformed churches in England and America, where that means Presbyterian and Episcopal and Congregational and Reformed Baptist churches, the preterist approach is the majority read. And you had debates in the late 19th century as to whether the book of Revelation was written in the 90s and deals with the destruction of the Roman Empire, or whether it was written in the 60s and deals with the destruction of Jerusalem, mainly. That was the big debate among the preterists. And so you have to debate the book, dating of the book of Revelation. And by the end of the 19th century, most preterists would say that Revelation was written in the 60s and deals with the destruction of Jerusalem and with the destruction of Rome. Then there was some debate about which passages deal with which things. But that would be what you come up with. The earlier preterist view said it deals with the Roman Empire. As this view got more and more refined, they began to say, no, the book was really written in the 60s, and it deals with Jerusalem and Rome. And so that becomes sort of the standard preterist view, which we are going to use. That's my approach. That's what I think is correct. At the same time, the futurist view was being developed. You developed it to the point where you had a pre-tribulation rapture. And then others said no, a mid-tribulation rapture, and others said a post-tribulation rapture. And then there was an amillennial approach that said there is a post-tribulation rapture, but the tribulation is the whole church period and not just 7 years. The 7 years is a symbol for the whole church age, and so forth and so on. You have futurists said the world is coming to an end, things are getting worse and worse. You have preterists who said these judgments happened in the 1st and 2nd century, and really probably, the kingdom is moving forward. And both of these views had lots of adherents. And then in the 20th century, something happened that kind of canceled out the preterist view as far as most people were concerned, and led the futurist view to be the main opinion until the last 15 years or so. What was the event that more or less killed the preterist approach and killed the optimistic approach to Bible prophecy and caused people to say, really the world is coming to an end and Jesus is coming soon? It's over, and the book of Revelation is telling us about horrible events that are going to happen in our own lifetime, and all we can hope is that we're going to get raptured out of it. What was that event? No, it was World War I. The Great War. See, we think of World War I and World War II. But until World War II happened, there was no such thing as World War I. It was the Great War. Not until you had a second one did you go back and call the first one number one. And the Great War completely destroyed Europe's confidence in a European future. And since Europe is the center of Christian civilization, we've often said postmillennialism, that is an optimistic view of the future, became impossible after World War I. Look at all these people that were killed. Well, as a matter of fact, there had been worse wars. The 30 Years' War lasted 30 years. And the Black Death in Europe killed a whole lot more people than World War I. The reason World War I struck people so bad is that they had actually been pretty optimistic for a long time that they had kind of moved beyond wars. They were living in the Gene Roddenberry universe where we have solved all these problems. Like Star Trek, we don't use money anymore. We've moved beyond envy and jealousy. And they were thinking this way, and then there's this war. It started in Yugoslavia, where it might start again still. And that kind of shattered people's confidence. It was the end of the 19th century optimism. The French Revolution had been the end of the papal-centric view. The French Revolution happened just a couple of decades after the event that ended the classical period in art, which was the Lisbon earthquake. Instead of nature being nice and calm and placid, all of a sudden nature kills people. And so you move from a classical to a romantic, more mysterious and frightening view of the natural world into this period in history. But the French Revolution is what really stopped this. I don't know why did I bring that up, but it's the same kind of event. It brings about a change in consciousness when these events happen. The French Revolution kind of knocked out the papal-centric interpretation of Revelation. World War I knocked out any optimism about the future for those who'd had it. And then you had World War II. And so the futurists have had kind of a heyday in the 20th century. The world's coming to an end. Now, there's some problems with that. Really, you're saying that the white world is coming to an end, which is kind of racist when you get right down to it. I mean, why should we assume that the history of Christianity is the history of white people? And then when white European civilization comes to an end, and when white European civilization has wars, and when white European civilization has a common market, and when white European civilization has a papacy, and when white European civilization has communism, well, that must be the end. It is kind of racially chauvinistic to assume that there is no future for black people and red people in Latin America and yellow people in Asia. They're not going to have a future. The end of our future is the end of the world. And I like to say that to people who say, well, all the signs are being fulfilled, Jesus is coming soon. And I say, you assume that God's interest in saving the human race and in building the church extends basically only to the history of white European civilization. The gospel is not going to go and have the same impact in the rest of the world. We really don't want to believe that. I mean, that's not what we should be saying. And when we make too easy an assumption that because it looks like Western civilization is coming to an end, and I believe it is, therefore, Jesus has to come soon. Western civilization is a conglomeration of Bible and pagan Greek philosophy. It needs to fall apart. You can't mix oil and water forever. They separate. And they're separating now. And we need to develop a more consistently Christian civilization for the future, and I believe we will. But when people say Western civilization looks like it's falling apart and then they get real upset about that, remember Western civilization is built on a mixed foundation. There's a lot of sand underneath the floor. A lot of Plato and Aristotle and Cicero. We don't need those guys. They were queers. Okay? And I can guarantee you, if you're a homosexual, you don't come up with philosophy that's worth reading. You see, if you look at the Bible, it tells you this. It tells you in Daniel that in the period before the coming of Christ, the opposition is between Greece and Israel. In Zechariah, he says, I will raise up your sons, O Greece, against the sons of Israel. And if you read Daniel 11, it's these Greek civilizations that make war on Israel. And the opposition is between philosophy and prophecy. And prophecy says, get into the world, even though you know you might suffer. You got to get to work, roll up your sleeves. So it's basically, an engagement approach. You get engaged in what's going on in the world. Philosophy says, sit back and take a look at it and contemplate it. Prophecy runs in a heterosexual direction, and philosophy runs in a homosexual direction. That's why the Greek philosophers were fags. And that's just the facts. They all were. That's what they celebrated.
Yeah, but how do you really feel about homosexuality?
I feel that homosexuality is an addiction like heroin. And people who become addicted to that lifestyle need help, but we certainly don't need to be saying that that's an alternative lifestyle that can be promoted. From everything I know about it, from reading and occasionally encountering people who have had experience in this, it is an addiction, and it's a terribly destructive thing. It starts in sin, but so do all kinds of other things. But I think pastorally speaking, if you view it that way, you can start to deal with people who are caught up in it. But the Greeks, all humor aside, and I was using humorous terms there, that's what it is. And there's a lot of that in our civilization, Western civilization. So now don't be too upset if Western civilization is collapsing a little bit now. We'll build a better Christian civilization on the other side of it. Well, get more serious now. We've moved beyond Greece and Israel and prophecy versus philosophy. Let's look at the preterist approach. There are several different preterist approaches. One I've mentioned is to see everything in Revelation concerning the Roman Empire. I don't think that works. Too much of it has to do with religious principles. And so, as I argued last time, I think the book is written in the 60s. It deals with the destruction of Jerusalem and also with Rome. Jerusalem is Babylon. The beast is Rome. And how these two link up, we'll look in the Old Testament. If you want to understand how they connect, go back to the Garden of Eden, where a serpent, a beast, committed spiritual seduction of Eve, and she became a harlot, so to speak. So the beast and the unfaithful woman theme starts in the garden, and then you can trace it through the Old Testament until you get to Revelation. The beast and the harlot. And we'll do that. Okay? That's the basic approach we'll be using. Now, one way to do that is to go back to Josephus, the Jewish historian, and start trying to go through the book of Revelation and identify historical events. I call this an ancient newspaper approach. Instead of using modern newspapers and saying, well, now look, here's a common market, Saddam Hussein and a new Babylon, and whatever. Wow, man, helicopters. These locusts here that fly, those could be Cobra helicopters. Because Cobra helicopters have hair like women and teeth like lions. And the sound of their wings is like the sound of chariots. Well, whatever. But that's the modern newspaper approach. The ancient newspaper approach is to constantly be going through Josephus and trying to link it up with details in the book of Revelation. Well, this is this battle when the Romans came in 67, and they fought at this field here. And then this one over here, that's when Vespasian went home and Titus took over. And this over here, that's this, that, and the other. Well, I think that if you lean on Josephus, you are leaning on a bruised reed. And here's why. Josephus gives us this whole history, the wars of the Jews, and then a second book called the Jewish War, which is dealing with the AD 70 war. The wars of the Jews and his history of the Jews, those two books, cover the entire history of the Bible, and he's full of mistakes. And all you have to do is lay down Kings and Chronicles next to Josephus, and you find he contradicts them all the time. And you think, how could this be? How could this man be a scholar? And he was a scholar, well-educated, Pharisee. He believed that Israel was in deep sin and deserved to be judged, and so he thought that the Roman army was God's avenging army to come in and punish the Jews. And that was his perspective, and that's the perspective from which he writes his books. And from that point of view, we can see that there's much to agree with. He doesn't write as a Christian, but he's full of factual errors. The second thing that's bizarre about Josephus is he's constantly writing us detailed histories of what the Herods did, chapter after chapter on the various Herods and their reigns and what they did and who they married and their relationship with the Roman governors. And he tells us all these different events that happen, and yet there's not one word about what goes on in the Gospels. Now you think about what happened in the Gospels. Jesus shows up, feeds 5,000, feeds 4,000, raises a little girl from the dead. He gets a Roman centurion all excited about him because he heals his servant. He raises Lazarus from the dead. Then he comes to Jerusalem. There's practically a riot in the city, and he's received as the Messianic king. Then he preaches in the temple day after day, and it's practically a riot every day in the city. And then there's a riot where they crucify him. Herod and Pilate, who have been enemies up to that point, become friends. That's the kind of thing Josephus would include. After this is over, well, we can ignore the empty tomb. Only a few people were talking about that. But then there's a big earthquake in the city, and there's another riot in the city on the day of Pentecost. People rush from all over the city. And then this continues. There's just continuous upheaval in the city until about 6 months or so after Pentecost. Stephen is stoned. And then the Christians are driven out of the city. Now, Josephus says nothing about that. How can you write a history of Israel at that time with people up in arms for months on end, big events taking place, weird stuff? The day Jesus was crucified, it was dark for about 3 hours in the afternoon, and people came out of their graves and roamed around. Josephus doesn't say anything about that. Josephus is obviously kind of like Time magazine. He only includes the news that fits. New York Times, all the news that fits, not all the news that's fit to print. Or to put it another way, statistics on how many Christians have spent nights in jail protesting abortion, that's not news fit to print. But we just ignore the news that we don't want to get out. Josephus is covering up all kinds of stuff. And so if you start leaning on Josephus to say, this is what's going on in Revelation here, there, and everywhere, you may well be diverted from what the Revelation is actually talking about. And I think that's what's happened. See, the army that crosses the Euphrates River and invades the land, as the Roman army, but I don't think it is. I think it's the church. They will do other things that I think are quite questionable in terms of interpreting the book. My approach to this book is going to be that it mainly deals with spiritual warfare and evangelism. That the battles that are pictured here have to do with the preaching of the gospel and that type of warfare, and the prayers and that type of warfare. The destruction of Jerusalem is referred to in chapter 17, where it says, "The 10 horns you saw in the beast, these will hate the harlot and make her desolate and naked and eat her flesh and burn her up with fire." Okay? For God has put in their hearts to execute His judgments by having a common purpose and by giving these kingdoms to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. And the woman you saw is the great city where the Lord was crucified, is what it's identified as earlier. So yes, the Romans turn against Jerusalem and burn her up. And that's mentioned there. But I'm not at all persuaded that battle after battle is in this book. I think most of the battles in this book are the same things that are recorded in the book of Acts. Somebody goes and preaches, and then they stone him. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city. You remember that? Now that means Paul's dead. I mean, it's kind of there underneath the text, but those Jews knew how to stone people, and if you get stones thrown real hard and banging into your body, several hundred of them, you're not alive at the end of that. They knew to stone until you were dead. They had done it before. And when it says they stoned Paul and they dragged him out of the city, and then he just got up and said, I'm fine, and walked off, you don't do that after you've been stoned. So we're to understand that Paul was either dead or so close to it you couldn't tell the difference, and he came back to life. That's the kind of thing I think that Revelation is mainly talking about. So I call this a preterist approach that focuses in on the events of the first century, but is not mainly concerned with the Roman army and its maneuvers, but is mainly concerned with the church and her maneuvers. And that's the approach we'll be taking to the book as we go. And of course, we have mentioned different things in these introductory lessons that point in that direction. This is not to say that we'll never have any occasion to call on Josephus to fill something in, but that's not where I think the main emphasis lies. Okay, the last point I have down here, and that we touched on last week, just for a second, we'll touch on here. Revelation is not written to Jerusalem. It's not written to Rome. It's written to these 7 churches, which are pictures of the church of all ages. And so it's always applicable. Okay? It tells us about the beast. It tells us about Babylon. And to those churches, it was talking about Rome and Jerusalem. But we are also these churches, and there are Babylons, and there are beasts out there, and there are Nicolaitans, and we dwell in the place where Satan's throne is, and we have access to hidden manna, and those things are all still true for us one way or another. So the book is always applicable. And so the historicists were right in applying it. The thematic guys are right in making many applications. The futurists are right in applying it to our own day, but they don't have the actual correct approach to the book as a prophecy. The specific prophecies are things that happen soon and dealt with that time. The principles are good for all time. Okay, that's it. That really does cover the history of interpretation here.
You think Chilton may have went too far using Josephus?
Yeah, a little bit too far. I would say that Gentry, and of course his work is not published, but he's working on it, and Chilton and some of the others whose material is out there uses a little bit too much of Josephus. There's a great deal of value in Chilton's commentary, but there are a few particular passages where I think that he leans too much on Josephus. And what happens is you start looking at Josephus and trying to identify some battle or some event with the passage in Revelation, you may overlook what would be a better approach. It's like I've heard people go through Romans and they say, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" And then they'll say, well, you know, the Romans had a custom that if you were a murderer, they would take the dead body of the person you killed and tie it to you, so you had to drag it around all the time. And that's what Paul's referring to, having to drag around this dead corpse all the time, which is a symbol of having to live with the tripped up by the flesh. Well, that's very attractive, but the problem is, if you like that so much that that's what you preach or teach, you ignore the fact that it's far more likely that when he says body of death, he's referring to the book of Leviticus and all the laws of clean and unclean. But you don't think of that because your mind has already made a jump to something in Roman culture. instead of saying, no, don't look at Roman culture, look back at the Old Testament. And what happens is people make a jump out to Josephus because something looks like it might be parallel, and I'm saying, hold off there, wait a minute, it may not be Josephus at all, it may be that we should look back at the themes in the Old Testament that will give us a different slant on what's going on here. So that's my general caveat against overusing Suetonius and Josephus. Okay, let's end this. We'll close in prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for your word, and thank you for the guidance that you've given to your people over the years. We thank you that Revelation is always applicable, and that saints in every generation have been encouraged by reading it and seeing that you do not allow your saints to go unavenged. And that we know that in our day that there are many beasts and there are many Babylons and there are many such things. So that as we study these things and look at their specific historical fulfillments in the first century, we ask that you would help us always to see their applications into our own lives. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.